Welcome to today's program titled Pioneers and Pathfinders Virtual Roundtable Series, Board Leadership in the Era of Artificial Intelligence. All participants are in listen-only mode. You're encouraged to submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit, a code will be read later on in the presentation. Please write this code down as it will not be repeated and it is required for the CLE credit request form. This program's recording will be distributed to all attendees in the days ahead. At this time, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker, Stephen Poor. Steve, you may begin.
Thank you, Sophia, and welcome to the Virtual Roundtable. This is another in our continuing series of roundtables where we talk to experts in the field of generative AI and the impact of it on businesses and talent. Today, and I want to thank all of you for taking your time to attend and listen. It should be a fabulous conversation. I want to extend special thanks to our panelists today for taking the time to share their wisdom and their insights on the topic. Let me introduce everyone. I'll go clockwise in the way I see people on the screen and start with a friend and partner of mine, Camille Olson, who is one of the highest level attorneys I've ever worked with. She focuses on issues with significant reputational risk, and companies rely on her in managing legal policy and media matters in those situations, as well as being one of the best litigators I've ever known. So thanks, Camille, for joining. Next is Paul Washington. Paul is the president and CEO of the Society for Corporate Governance. The Society is a not-for-profit organization with over 3,700 members dedicated to enhancing corporate governance through education, collaboration, and advocacy. Paul, thank you for joining. And third is Marissa Geist, who's the Chief Executive Officer at Cielo, world's leading talent acquisition partner. She also sits on their board of directors. Marissa, thank you for joining. Let's start off. I'll start with Camille. And Camille, maybe you could just sort of lay a baseline for us of responsibilities of the board vis-a-vis the C-suite. Give us some foundational information off of which we can work.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. And it's great to be here with you today, Steve, Paul, and Marisa. Let me just start by saying that when I think of the general fiduciary duties of boards, I generally categorize them into three general duties. First, the duty of care, which includes acting in good faith, acting with reasonableness, prudence, and active engagement and participation. I'll also just mention in Delaware, for example, there's also explicitly within this duty a duty of oversight and supervision, which includes implementing reporting controls and adequately monitoring for the company's operations. The second duty is the duty of loyalty. Loyalty to the corporation and its shareholders, acting in the best interests of the organization, avoiding conflicts of interest and self-dealing. The third is the duty of obedience. And when I think of obedience, I think of it both externally and internally. Internally, in terms of ensuring compliance with governing documents, such as articles of incorporation or bylaws, and externally, in terms of ensuring compliance with applicable laws, such as regulatory rules and state laws. The board generally is going to be the unit responsible for setting long-term goals and guiding the strategic direction of the business. In terms of sort of my shorthand for the C-suite, I think of the C-suite as carrying out the day-to-day operation towards meeting the goals that are set by the board. In the generative AI context, similar to these general duties and responsibilities of the board and the C-suite is going to be the group that's going to determine how to use GAI in the company's day-to-day operations. And the board has the duty to ensure that those executives are doing so in a compliant and reasonable manner. And they may also have the duty to affirmatively use or consider AI. I'm just going to mention a couple of questions that come up often in terms of board governance with respect to GAI. First, do the board's fiduciary duties extend to overseeing the company's use of generative AI? And secondly, does the duty of care extend to ensuring the company is in fact using AI in various areas in terms of growth opportunities, innovation, and efficiency? When I think of questions the board may ask the C-suite, one may be, is GAI being used in any areas where there is an unacceptable or a high level of risk in terms of its use? On the flip side, a board may also ask a question of, if GAI isn't being used in an area which has a potential high benefit, why not? And low risk or limited risk, why not? Are there barriers to doing so? And are there capital expenditures that need to be made? Where is there that gap? That's what I think about in terms of the board versus the C-suite and some of the questions that come up in terms of general board governance of GAI issues as it relates to the C-suite's activities.
Thanks, Camille. Let's pick up on some of those questions that you asked. Paul and Marissa, it's been a couple of years since ChatGPT landed with a thud or a boom, depending upon how you think about it, right? How are boards answering the questions Camille is posing? How has the general impact of generative AI impacted those core functions and duties? Paul, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I don't think in any way it changes those core duties that boards have, right? They still have the duty of care, duty of loyalty, nor do I think it changes the sort of key activities that the board does. Jay Lorsch, a professor up at Harvard, said the boards do three things. I would add a fourth. He said they decide, they oversee, they advise, and in today's environment, they also engage, whether with stockholders or others. So they're still fulfilling their duties, and they're still doing it in those four areas, right, in four ways. But I do think that generative AI serves as a test case for boards' governance. I actually think that the better governed a board is, the better it's in terms of its composition, its structure, its information, its education, the better it will be able to respond to AI, to fulfill its duties and to engage in those activities in a way that's appropriate. In addition to being a general test case for governance for companies, I also think it's a broader test case for companies on a couple other areas. It's a test case on where they are in the stockholder to stakeholder capitalism spectrum. Are they really focused exclusively on shareholder returns, or are they focused on serving multiple stakeholders? Because, if you're making a choice on AI that has a big impact on your workforce, how do you balance your workers' interests versus those of your stockholders? So I think it's going to be an important test case in that way. I also think it's going to be a test case in terms of, call it broader ESG or sustainability, social responsibility. Again, are you going to be engaging with AI in an environmentally and socially responsible manner? The wonderful thing about governance in America is you get to choose where you want to be on that spectrum, from Gordon Gekko to tree hugger, right? And I think this is going to cause companies to think about, if they've done it in the sort of pure sustainability context, but I think it gives them a chance to think about where they want to be on those spectrums.
So what's your answer to the question?
Well, I sit between the board and the company, as I sit on the board, and then I also deal with running the company. And I would say that one of the core functions of a board is actually making sure that we have the right conversation, which is not a new responsibility of the board. But when I think about the board's voice carrying a lot of weight in terms of what gets talked about there tends to be carried out of the company, I think the board has the responsibility of making sure it's appropriate and framing and helping with timing issues. So I bought my first textbook on Amazon for a marketing course in 1997. I couldn't get same-day groceries delivered to my house in the suburbs of Wisconsin, admittedly probably not Amazon's primary market, until right after the pandemic started. That's a 25-year stretch. So if I think about somebody like Target, a competitor to Amazon, In 1997, what was Target's board asking about in terms of the internet or the impact of automation? Probably not a ton relative to what they're asking Target to focus on now. So when I think about in terms of what the board should do, it's setting the tenor and tone and a lot of the timing of the conversations that you need to have as a company and making sure you're appropriately situated for the moment you're in when nobody really knows the moment, where the moment's going to go. So I think as a board, that responsibility of making sure the right things are talked about when, it's not a new responsibility, but certainly it's a tougher one to manage when you're writing history as it comes.
I want to pick up, Paul, on something you said, and this is a question for everybody. This shareholder to stakeholder balance. I know every company does it differently, but in the context of generative AI, what are the variables that ought to be considered at the board level in striking that balance?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll just toss it out. I mean, I think, let me give you a sort of practical example. When we did M&A at Time Warner, where I served as corporate secretary for 20 years, basically, we looked at when we're doing that's a similar transformative kind of experience, you know. We obviously looked at long-term shareholder value, but we also looked at other aspects when we were doing M&A. We looked at the impact on, which tied to shareholder value. But we looked at reputational risk, we looked at legal risk, we looked at impact on communities, we looked at impact on employees and so forth. So we actually looked at those different areas. So I think, you know, again, how each company balances it is going to be up to them, but I do think that it's useful to at least have on your checklist as a board, okay, what are the various impacts? And similarly, when we did executive compensation decisions, took us a while because first it was just, okay, does this work for the board and for management, right? And then we included, okay, does it work for investors? Because you had say on pay votes. And then over time, we expanded it to think about the other ways that our executive compensation decisions would be seen. So for putting this into practice, it's as simple as in your board materials or your board memos or your board discussions, make sure that you're thinking about each of the different constituencies and their impact, and then it's up to you as to how to balance them in any given such situation. And it may change. You don't necessarily give the same weight to employee impact or community impact on every decision, right? But I do think it's important to have it as part of your considerations. That means sort of maybe revising your board memo template.
Yeah, and just a couple of comments just following up on that. You know, I would say that if we look at just, you know, the last 12 months or so, it seems as though boards have, not a large percentage, but 15 to 20% of them have actually included disclosures with respect to how the board itself is dealing with these issues and managing and overseeing generative AI. Sometimes that will come in the form of a specific committee that's going to have oversight either on AI ethics or a specific committee such as an audit committee or a technology committee whose existing oversight is going to be expanded to include generative AI. Some boards are also assigning AI oversight to committees focused specifically on environmental, societal, or public policy issues. And in doing so, there's no, I would say, one right way that I've seen, but it depends also on the risks and the social implications of generative AI that you actually want to deal with. And it may be that it belongs in more than one of those committees. Yeah. Are they privacy concerns? Are they security concerns? Are they the potential to perpetuate bias in terms of the data? Is it the propensity to hallucinate and actually produce results that are wrong in terms of your products and what your services are? So in terms of the issues that Paul is identifying, those are really important. And there's no question that they need a home. But from what I see, there are sometimes multiple homes within a board. Yeah. That is actually going to deal with that issues. I'd be very interested in hearing what Paul and Marissa, are seeing as well.
Marissa, why don't you go first? So I got some thoughts on this.
Sure, yes. I think this is one of the most important ways that a board can address this topic of AI is making sure that someone and somebody is not a part-time job looking at this. And I think at the beginning of any massive change, you need to over-index on making sure there's a cross-disciplinary focus on this. So if you put it with compliance and risk, you're going to get a very compliance and risk angled answer to it that might leave out the market dynamics. And conversely, if you put it in the revenue generation side of the committees, then you're going to ignore potentially very damaging, very caustic liability that sits over in the legal and InfoSec session. So what we're seeing best-in-class boards do is say, for a period of time and with a very clear remit and a sort of build, operate, transfer model, define who needs to be in the right discussion, what are the questions we need to answer, and one of the other things is to create a language of how you're going to talk about this at the board level. It's so new, talking about how do you characterize what part of AI we're talking about, because AI is as broad as business. You can be talking about the risk, you can be talking about the revenue generation. So as a board, like you said, Paul, it can expose if you're not, your muscles aren't as strong as they need to be about decision-making, risk tolerance, risk mitigation. So this committee has to design the way you're going to ingest the information about AI. And I think if you put it in an existing committee, that bias of information and output could actually be really dangerous. And you could be opening to, like you said, Camille, you could be scaling a problem you didn't know you really had, but certainly will be held accountable and held to task. And when I think about just the amount of information that comes out about AI every day, I mean, we have about 500,000 articles published in the last 18 months on AI. If this is someone's project job, or if this is not given focus, the ability for somebody to be able to actually keep their head around what's happening, tough, really a tough assignment. And then therefore, again, it opens you up to risk and missed opportunity in terms of the implications of how this sort of spiders to the business. Shouldn't exist forever, should definitely have that sort of a year before everyone has a language and a way of ingesting this information. But I don't know if fitting it into an existing committee is a best practice.
Let me just pick up on that, because I think, the committee structure that we live in with the United States is largely still dictated by, the wake of Sarbanes-Oxley and the listing standards. And it's a very much focused on the board playing an overseeing nanny state we don't believe management can be trusted kind of role, right? So that's the structure we're under, and that actually is not the structure you kind of need. The way when we did a roundtable at the conference board with CEOs and talked about the oversight of ESG, and actually in sustainability, it actually translates kind of nicely, I think, into AI, which is you really want to think about when you've got something transformative, whether it's sustainability or digital technology transformation, you want to think about it in three buckets. You want to think about what does it mean for us in the marketplace? That's the products and services we sell as well as those we buy. What does it mean for us in the workplace? That's our people as well as our operations. And what does it mean for us in the public space? And that's communications, that's government relations, that's corporate citizenship, it's philanthropy. And I think that what this can, whether you set up whether you work with existing committees or you add a special task force or something, you should think about, I think it's helpful for companies to think about how are we covering workplace, marketplace, and public space. And frankly, the workplace operational side is often neglected at the board level, and sometimes the marketplace, what you buy, is also sometimes neglected at the board level. That's supply chain, and the marketplace of stuff you sell is not dealt with at a committee level, but just at the board level. So I think there's sort of gaps here that you want to think about. How are we going to fill this? And do we have a special technology committee? Do we set up the chairs of different committees, or do we just use the full board in some way that focuses on marketplace, workplace, and public space? Because I think it's only by looking at those three areas, which don't necessarily align to your existing committee structure, you're going to be able to identify all the relevant use cases associated with AI in each of those three areas and the risks and the opportunities in each of those three areas. So anyway, I think this is a chance to revisit, even if in this particular area, but maybe more broadly, your committee structure.
You talk about balancing some of these issues, Paul, and there are so many conflicting interests here in generative AI. They're just thinking about the workforce. There's going to be early adopters. There are going to be people coming into the workforce expecting these tools and capabilities to be available. Then there's going to be people that are afraid of it taking their jobs. You've got vendors out there, supply chain. It's a communication challenge. What's the role of the board in not just developing a strategy, but making sure it's being communicated, and taking into account all these various interest groups?
I mean, this is, first of all, boards are struggling right now with information overload in a lot of areas, right? They get too much detail. So this is a real challenge, and it's really a challenge that sits mostly with management to make sure that they're providing the board with the information that it needs. I think the first thing is the management needs to sort of present to the board, okay, here's where we think AI, generative AI, intersects with our business in these different areas: marketplace, workplace, public space, right? So, and these are the use cases that we think we have. And then you provide relevant information relating to those areas. So it's up to management to sort of help define the field for the board. And then I think in terms of getting information to the board, look, one of the things that's really important is management often tends to focus on, okay, it tends to be sort of inwardly focused. Like, here's our strategy and this is what we're doing, and, you know, pat us on the back and this is what we're doing, moving along. It's so important for the management to continue to provide the board with information on what's happening outside the company. What are our incumbent competitors doing with this technology, and what are emerging competitors doing with this technology? And then the other thing that I think you can't ignore here is what are our suppliers doing with this technology, and what are our customers doing with this technology? So you got to give them that information as well. And it's just really important. I think there's an opportunity here very much for not only the management to be providing this information to the board, but to bring in some third parties too, trusted third parties who aren't going to give you a generic presentation or a sales pitch or something, but are going to tailor their presentation on what's going on in the environment to that particular company. Because frankly, there's so much here that you can't, just to pick up on Marissa's point, and we can get into this too, what management needs to do to make sure they're staying on top of this. You can't do this as a sideshow. It's got to be somebody's sort of day job, and so you have to have enough resources within management to provide this information. Just don't tack it onto someone else's existing responsibilities. It's really too much.
Can I follow on to that, Paul? I think just sitting again with the management team as well as with the board, I think each company and each board has a personality, and whether you skew from, like you said, Gordon Gekko all the way up to tree hugging, but also, are you a growth focused or are you an efficiency play? And where you fall in those quadrants tends to skew where you invest time, resource, and energy. And really getting a framework to make sure the board isn't missing a trick, and having a good viewpoint on what AI could potentially do across all of those disciplines, all of those dimensions, like you mentioned. I think the Institute for the Future of Work out of London outlines 6 ways that AI could disrupt or change the way we work. One is displace work. So it replaces the work, no longer exists. It can create work. Where is there opportunity where, you know, roles and work that didn't exist before, like a digital co-pilot? That didn't even exist in our vernacular 5 years ago. It can augment. So basically, you know, if you're a radiologist in reading a tool set, you know, you don't have to go and look up, oh, how big does this tumor have to be for me to be worried about it? It tells you what you need to know right there. It intensifies. And this is where I think a lot of boards with their natural sort of command and control, like you said, the nanny state, there's this sort of, if you're a very highly regulated or very highly efficiency driven company, intensification really means I know how long a task takes to do it, and I create systems to make sure people are doing it in that way and at that speed. And if you're really hung up on this, you can miss the other ones that we just talked about, but also you don't leverage the right and growth mindset. So I think having a good rounded view as a board really important, that you not only have that intensification view, but you also are asking the simple questions of telepresence is the fifth aspect. Are you using all the tools you have today? And then, matching, how are you matching information with decisions? So across those 6 dimensions, typically what we see as a board is kind of hardwired to do 2 or 3 of those well. But to your point about bringing in experts that augment what you do as a board and making sure you've got a good view, and forcing the company to get out of probably the 1 or 2 that they feel like is a good home base for that discussion. As a board, that's your responsibility, because somebody can come in as a new entrant to the market that's focusing on a more expansive view of what AI can do, and you could be disrupted. And as a board, you're not supposed to let those kind of surprises come around the corner.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I would comment on that is I think that generative AI has really brought to boards almost, sort of in an unprecedented way, the need for expertise and retraining of not just employees, but board members, and imparting to them at least basic understandings regarding, what generative AI is, how it is regulated, the fact that, many US-centric companies operate across the globe. And those multi-jurisdictions view the kinds of risks we're talking about in very different ways. But to know that that is even relevant, and it needs to be just not necessarily a one answer to how you're managing a risk, is something that I believe requires a basic set of understanding as to, what the opportunities and benefits are in different areas, both services as well as product, and then what the types of risks are and what types of frameworks may apply, and that they may be different. And I think that's new. And I think that in my experience, many boards, as well as many CEOs and leadership teams, are really struggling with making sure that they're understanding just the frameworks to be able to ask the questions.
Could not agree with you more. And look, there's PwC and the Conference Board did a joint report. They've been doing it for a bunch of years on what the C-suite thinks about the board's capabilities. And for the last several years, only about 50% of C-suite executives think that their board understands the current impact of digital technology on their business. That's half. So you got half the companies out there, if management's right, that where the board isn't even up to speed. But I couldn't agree with you more, Camille. You need firsthand experience. We did this actually at Time Warner, where back in the early 2000s, where we exposed the board members, they got to play with different technologies affecting the digital transmission of music. That's when we were going from CDs to streaming services. So we actually gave them the chance to play with the technology in a safe way. I think there's no substitute for that here. You actually have to have some firsthand experience here with this. With the technology, not at the board meeting, and frankly at the management meeting, because sometimes CEOs and others like to pretend they know stuff they don't, right? Because they're used to being knowledgeable and the smartest person in the room. So I think actually making sure your senior management team is also educated in the technology, they get to play with it. That firsthand experience with it, and then you got to keep up with this, because the difference, as you pointed out, Marissa, this isn't Amazon time. This is moving at such a fast rate as the technology changes. This isn't sort of, okay, well, we played with ChatGPT in 2023 and we're done. No, actually, you've got to keep up with it, and it's multiple permutations. So anyway, I agree with you, Camille. I think there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be laid first on the general impact of digital technology, but the firsthand feel for this is something that's different.
It's changed the type of person you're looking for to be on a board?
I think hopefully you've already made the shift to having people on the board who come with an attitude of always wanting to learn and to contribute, and come not to sort of with all the answers, but to learn together. You hopefully already have a board that has the posture of continuous learning, right, and not continuous lecturing. But sometimes and that, but I do think it makes a change sometimes in even who might be the leadership of your board, because sometimes your lead independent director is just the person who's been around longest and so forth, and that might not be actually the person who's going to serve as a role model of continuous learning for your board. So I think it may open the door to have people with more technology experience, maybe some younger directors and so forth. But you know what? My experience is our older directors were the fastest adopters of digital technology. Folks who were 70 and older actually were faster than the folks who were in their 50s in adapting to new technology. So I don't think you have to, I wouldn't buy into the age bias on this one. I think it's more of a mentality and a perspective that if you're eager to learn together, along with management, this also requires management to be in continuous state of learning. So CEOs have to be comfortable saying, I don't know yet, but this is something we're all learning together. So I think that's the sort of person you want to be looking for. Hopefully you've got them already, but if you don't, that's a key thing I'd look for now.
Yeah, I would echo that, and kind of has two things come to mind. So I have 4 boys, and one of them happens to be 13 years old. And he knows how to set up bots in his video games to go spam for gems. They mine in fictitious cities. He also helped me figure out how to automate some content generation that I needed in my safely ring-fenced AI environment that we had. I think he's a good person to show us how people that already know how to do these things will think about work and approach work. He does not know how to construct a change management plan, do a business strategy. So I also wanted, it is this hot new skill set that I think we should look to native users to teach us how, not even teach us, just to show us how they think about the expectation of how they bring it into work. That isn't a substitute for leading a company, governing a board. Right. So I think with every new hot skill that comes through, we tend to over-index. That doesn't take the place of business leadership. So I totally agree with what you just said about, it changes who you want in the boardroom to participating in discussions. I don't know if it changes the permanent board makeup as we kind of get online with what all of these changes mean. So that, when I think about who's in the boardroom, that's not fundamentally changing it. However, I kind of go back to the first point we made about what is the purpose of the board. It probably is unveiling if you've had board members that aren't fit for purpose or are not contributing in the way you need to. This will force those discussions a little bit more quickly. I think that is something that if you haven't been facing into a board seat that hasn't been generating value, this will probably be a place where that spotlight shines brightly.
Yeah, and just one comment, I would echo both of your comments. And I would say that, it's sort of odd for me to say it as, the question was, does it change who you're looking for? It doesn't, but I believe it emphasizes certain opportunities and values and thinking models for board members. So, capital expenditures that have always gone in a certain way, making massive changes to those to be able to, capitalize on the opportunities of generative AI. I mean, that requires somebody with a very open mind, creativity, I'll say the term risk taker, but it's got to be somebody who's open to those developments, right? And while we would hope that all of our board members have some of those qualities, hopefully in different degrees, so that there's a balance. But I think that's important. It's important on capital investments. It's important just on who you are as a business going forward. Are you going to change who you are and what you provide as services and products? And it also impacts significantly your workforce. To one of the points that Paul made. And the question is, are you going to reinvest? Are you going to think differently about how you engage and how you prepare and how you plan changes? And who are you going to partner with to do that? So I would say that, they're not different questions, but perhaps they're more important in terms of some of these qualities going forward. I don't know if that resonates with anyone.
It definitely resonates with me. I mean, the notion of being open-minded, and that which goes with, it's a prerequisite to continuous learning. There are a couple areas where I do think experience in certain areas is a little more important. I'm not talking about, oh, I'm a cyber expert, I'm a tech expert. I'm actually thinking, I've been at a company that's gone through transformation, cultural or technological or some other form of transformation. And maybe I've been at a company that's done it well and a company that's done it poorly, right? Because I think having the negative experience is really useful as well. So I think if you're bringing on CEOs or whomever who've just been at a steady state company and run really well for 10 or 15 years, that's lovely, but that person may not be prepared for the sort of disruptive transformation. So I think that's an area where I would look for experience. People who have successfully dealt with transformation, people who have successfully dealt with and even seen failures in innovation. So I'd look for that. And if there's one other area that, and I'm a little hesitant to go there, but I do think some more experience on the cultural side, on the human capital side, I actually don't like the term, so workforce side, just because what we're seeing thus far is, because at least people with that experience in the room may be prompting the asking of the question, to make sure the questions are being asked about the workforce. Because, one thing that came through in some conference board research is that 92% of CEOs say this is going to change our, the training we need for our workers. It's going to change, increase productivity and so forth. And yet only about 60% of those same CEOs said it's going to change strategic workforce planning. Well, okay. And only a smaller percentage actually have a workforce plan, so at a board level. So I actually think that this is an area where if you're not paying attention to who's in your workforce now, if you don't have a workforce strategy to say this is the workforce we have now and this is the one we need in 5 years and this is how we're going to get there, if you're not already measuring productivity, if you don't have those baseline strategies, this baseline metrics in place, you better get them. And you may need someone on the board who will encourage you to get them, because otherwise you could really be up Preppy Creek without your khakis on this one. So
I think it just, obviously I'm in the talent space, so I probably have some bias in terms of how important I think this particular point is. But when we talk about, and Camille, you said this too, scaling bias in your workforce, there's a lot of ways that AI will spider into the conversation. Hopefully on the board, you already have someone who runs a people committee or a chair of making sure that you're creating a business that people want to work at and is good for the communities it's sitting in. I think when we think about how AI works with workers or talent, there's actually, this isn't new, but even before Gen AI in 2011, there was a study out of Cambridge that was talking about how robots interact with work and how people feel about automation in their work. And it was with pharmacists and really kind of the drugs in the pharmacy that helped people prescribe and research and spend time with patients. Well, so they put this middleware in effectively that helped the pharmacist spend more time with patients, where they didn't have to do the research, they didn't have to sort of match the drug and the side effects, and really that was served up to them. Pharmacists loved it. The farm techs that loaded the actual product into the machines hated it, because that machine was telling them what to do, and they were doing the last mile of physical tasks that couldn't be automated. Whereas the pharmacist thought, wow, this is amazing, I get more time with patient care. That kind of large scale disruption of how people feel about the work you have for them, the quality of life they experience at work, the type of roles you're creating, somebody has to, at the board level, be taking that macro view of, and what will this do to the workplace you are creating? How is this going to affect how people interact with the work you are creating, the work you are doing? And just to make sure you're not creating that vacuum of a first class and a third class society in your company and your products and your service, all the way up and down your supply chain and your customers. That should be something that is in the people committee remit at the board level, and probably takes an arm's length view of someone stepping back and just saying, let's just play this out. Let's just step away and play this out.
And I just want to pick up on this, because at the society, we've got this annual national conference, and our lead speaker was an economist. He was talking about what's happening in the global economy, U.S. economy, slower growth, AI's role in increasing productivity. And one thing that struck me was that here's an economist who was talking about, okay, how do you measure the impact of AI? And it wasn't just productivity, output per worker. this economist said that maybe the most important measure you're going to have on AI's impact is from your employee engagement surveys. I thought it was really interesting. Like, how are your employees, what impact is introducing this new technology having on your workforce and in particular segments of your workforce? Because as you pointed out, Marissa, actually there's a real risk that AI is going to increase economic inequality in our country and around the world, because it's sort of the middle level jobs that may go away. The higher level jobs can be protected because you require that higher level human thing, or that human judgment, and then the lower level jobs that are more blue collar aren't going to be replaced by AI. It's that middle impact. And so anyway, I just thought it was really telling that you have this economist who are not necessarily known for embracing things like employee engagement surveys, saying that may be even more than productivity, the most important metric the company should be looking at in a broken down way, by different segments of the workforce, on the impact of AI.
Marissa, let me follow up on something you said. You talked about the people committee, and earlier on you talked about cross-functional collaboration at the board level in terms of the importance of it. Is it equally important for the board to be pushing back to make sure that cross-functional collaboration is being implemented at the management level as well? Because I know a lot of companies sometimes operate as silos, and that's a real problem when it comes to implementing and designing generative AI. What's the board's responsibility to ensure that you've broken down those walls at the management and operational level?
It's a really good point, and I think one of the sentinel duties of a board is to think things through the whole way, versus we've addressed the 10% of it and we'll just trust you to run the rest of the road. When we talk about cross-functional, when I think one of the true values, and the value I get from my board as well, is when I come with an idea and they say, well, have you thought about this, this, and this? And by nature of that sort of cross-examination, not, I'm sure, to the extent the actual lawyers have been cross-examined, but in my own sort of layman's interpretation of what that would look like, that cross-examination forces that sort of unintended consequences discussion. And I think as a board, who else can challenge the CEO like that? Who else can challenge the management team? Certainly, especially the larger and more hierarchical the company is. And in some places, that's where the danger really sits, is with companies that have been more siloed, have been more hierarchical. The board is really that body that is supposed to push and pull on those ideas and make sure, Paul, you said something about making sure you fund things and you put the meat behind what we're talking about. I think that's also the board's responsibility. You can't have an answer that looks good in PowerPoint and no one's asked the question, well, who's going to do it? How are you going to be able to afford it? What is the capital expenditure that goes along with it? What is it taking away from? What are we don't want to stop paying our fire insurance to build a better bot, and then the server room catches on fire. This is obviously a totally grossly negligent conversation, but where are you shortcutting to be able to afford this new growth that could put us at risk? Those are all board level discussions, because those are board level dollars that we're talking about, or should be. And so I think that is a really important role that only the board can play in many cases.
Yeah, and on Marissa's point, which I agree with completely, I think that boards recognize, or I believe they should recognize, that management is more likely to be overly optimistic about what they can do, and also perhaps tied to past expenditures or sunk costs and investments. And I think it is the board's function to really press there and to make sure that the appropriate funding is in place and the forward-looking investments are really being considered, because there obviously is always a limit, right, on what's available for capital investments. And most executives have already committed to plans and the allocation of capital, not just this year, but for years going forward, of course, right? So readjusting that and having a environment where it's okay to question and realign those capital expenditures, I think the board's role in that is critical.
I'll just add one thing. So I agree entirely. The board should ask, do you have a cross-functional team put in place? Because this is a team sport, right? And then who's on it? By the way, does that have a, without micromanaging, does it have a charter? Does it have a mandate? And what kind of support is it getting, right? And I think just asking those questions can force management to say, oh, I guess we ought to. And because one of the things, and this is a place where lawyers and governance professionals can really step in and help. You may already have existing sustainability steering committees. You may have existing, DEI committees. You may have cyber technology. So think about, okay, what's worked with those other cross-functional teams? What hasn't worked? Learn from those other experiences too within management to make sure that this one works well. This also raises, and I don't know if you want to get there, Steve, but it also raises sort of the question more broadly of how companies at the management level approach innovation. So every company's got an enterprise risk management system. You're required to have under the stock exchange listing standards a report to the audit committee or to the board on how you manage risk every year. But companies don't necessarily have an enterprise opportunity management system. And this is a chance to at least ask that question. Like, okay, well, we do our annual strategic planning process. Sometimes it's cut and paste from the prior year, right? We have our annual budgeting process. But how do we actually have an opportunity management system that responds in real time, because this is all moving faster than your annual planning process, to opportunities as they show up? Because you respond to risks as they show up more frequently, but do you have a way of approaching opportunities? So that goes beyond the steering committee, right, that's looking at AI in particular, and actually asks the broader question of how are we addressing opportunities within the company? And I don't think you can just sort of take it for granted that management has given sufficient thought to this.
Yeah, and on that point, Paul, I would say that I would be very concerned if a management team told me as a board member that we've still got people who are really interested in the innovation opportunities for GAI, and we're having those people engage in a number of pilots, because in my experience, some companies are frozen in that pilot stage as opposed to this cross-functional stage, and I find that very dangerous.
I think that
and look, one of the things is interesting. Oh, sorry, go on, Marissa.
No, please continue. Please continue on that vein.
Just one of the things that's really interesting about being able to take advantage of the use cases here is getting your business people and your tech people to talk together, your software developers and your business people who may have never talked to each other before, who may not even speak the same language. And I think that's one of those things that a board can also ask about. Like, so what is the interaction between your business people and your technology people on this? So you get it out of that silo over here, and you actually, get to the people who really be using it, where it will have a P&L impact. Because it's a little bit like where sustainability was a bunch of years ago, where the finance people were over here and the sustainability people were over there. They didn't speak the same language at all either. So I think that, to my mind, is if there's a sweet spot for companies to focus on, it's at the conversation between your business people and your software developer people, your technology people, and having those conversations. Obviously, HR, obviously, legal, all the other folks have to be involved in that. But I think that if there's an axis that you've got to make sure is a very strong communication, a bond there, it's between those two folks.
And Paul, what I was going to add on, and actually that even more to your point about who's talking to whom and how you connect up conversations, one of the exciting and also sort of terrifying things that's happening with the Gen AI and just tech and sort of resetting of many different markets, products, is that the things you used to look at to know if you were okay, the key indicators used for your business, probably won't be the same key indicator. They might be different levels in the key indicator, but in many cases are different indicators altogether. So at a board level, making sure that what you're looking at is actually going to answer the question of, are we growing? Are we profitable enough? Are we fast enough? Are we lean enough? Are we safe enough? You can't assume that the indicators of 10 years ago are going to keep you in good stead in the future. And I think, again, as a board, how do you know that what you're looking at are really the indicators that are going to answer the question. So in a lot of cases, that means stepping back and saying, what do we need to know? And who knows that? Because people, the different groups that used to resident hold that information might not be the people that are closest to the front line to know. Actually, a better way to measure that is over here. So when you think about it as a board, really taking a step back and saying, what have we been looking at for 10 years and 5 years? Are these even the things we need to be looking at again? And who would know what we should be looking at? And to the point about disruption that you said, Camille, and to new products and services that you said, Paul, what are the things we look at to know that we're actually taking advantage of the moment and also in the right moment?
Yeah, and looking at how you're doing compared to others too, right?
Yes.
Like, how's our innovation rate? I mean, that's, I could not agree with you more. There's another thing that I think we're touching on here, which is there's a big gap between the information that's held by people who are sort of at the line level versus CEO versus board. And I'm even going to like draw the contrast with the chief legal officer. So when asked in a survey recently, like, are you currently using Gen AI? 37% of CLOs said, yeah, we're already using Gen AI at our company. 37%. 23% of CEOs said they were, and only 12% of board members said they were. So there's a current gap, like, because the legal officers know, okay, we had to prove that, right? So there's a big gap on knowledge. And then what was even more striking to me was that 32% of board members said they don't think they're going to use generative AI. 32%. That's compared to, I think, 9% of CEOs and 2% of chief legal officers. So there's a big gap right now that exists in the knowledge of the current state of the deployment of Gen AI within companies and the prospects for it. So that's just, you know, that's not any specific company, but overall, there's a real need for more information to be flowing up to the board about what you're already doing and the potential of it. I was struck by those figures.
How do you get that communication working effectively? Because it's also easy to overwhelm board members with information. How do you, any guideposts for how you tailor that communication to close it? That gap is somewhat shocking.
So what we used to do is, because I used to draft the talking points, that was my job for the CEO. Like, we always had at the, you know, in the board meeting, there was a time where management gave an update. And we talked about what are our key strategic priorities, and, you know, we just built it in there. And you would build in the information there on AI. So it's sort of built into your ordinary, this is an important strategic matter for us, and then it's built into the sort of general business update. I then think you have deep dives on this, and I think you probably want to be having deep dives fairly consistently in this area. This isn't a once a year thing. You know, it's more frequent. So I think you go deeper in looking at, and you can choose, okay, we're going to talk about marketplace here, we're going to talk about workplace here, we're going to talk about public space here. So you can divvy it, but I think you want to build it both. You want to do two things. You want to build it into the regular reporting process, orally and in writing. And then you do want to have special, you know, deeper dives, and including sometimes bringing in outside speakers, even at board dinners and board lunches and things like that. You got some time available. And I would deploy that time constructively, because this is so fast moving. This isn't, you know, and I think that one of the biggest challenges here, Marissa, for any company when there's a transformative technology is how fast do you move, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and here, the window for moving fast may be shorter than in the past. You know, like you might have had, you know, I came from a media company where technological transformation was always predicted to be happening just tomorrow, right? No, and it took a long time for Netflix to come around. But what might have been a 10-year window in the past may be a 2-year window now.
And I would say as well, it is interesting that we have these very old and traditional ways of communicating with board members. Here's your board pack, and here's the meeting that we sit in for 4 hours or 6 hours, or here's a special session. What we actually found is the technology itself is pretty interactive. And so freeing your mind that it has to be in the traditional channels to deliver information, you can do a voiceover and a video and do a screen share of this is how we're using it at our company. This is what we're seeing. So if you can get boards used to receiving information in more bite-sized chunks in different non-traditional formats, I think that actually helps everyone, because the days of being able to sit down with a printed 120-page board pack to go through that, I mean, I don't even know anyone that would like to receive information in that way anymore, but certainly if by the time you print it, you have something else to say about it, it's likely not the best way to get the information. So challenging and changing and modernizing some of the board to the back and forth of the board, I think is really important as well.
And boards did that during the pandemic, right?
Yes.
So we saw a lot more interstitial communication, a lot more informal board calls and so forth, and other ways of getting information. And this, frankly, is a more positive experience. But taking some of the lessons of the pandemic and how fast boards needed to, learn and think and move, then can be applied in this environment as well.
This also, I think, is a good opportunity to bring in outside help. So somebody who structured this discussion before, one of the interesting things, and Paul, this goes back to your stats about who thinks they're using what where, you might not have it resident in your own tech stack, but assuredly some of your partners have Gen AI that is making it into the way that you work. And while there's not a lot created on how we digest and think about this, there is some. So we are starting to see emerging expertise of some of the consultancies or even some of the industry analysts, people that can help you have a better discussion about this. So to your point about invite someone in for a board lunch to talk about where you might find it, don't think that you have to think of everything resident in your own company. I think when we think about back in Silicon Valley taking off versus someplace else in the world, like the average European CIO had 2 to 3 professional connections during that rapid internet expansion tech boom of the late 90s, early 2000s. The average CIO, CEO in Silicon Valley had 60 plus. So the reason we were able to ideate in our West Coast much more quickly than, say, outside the US is because those networks were formed and we were sharing and co-creating outside of the walls of our company. I think that's just naturally going to be a shift anyway, but it should show up in the boardroom as well for a board to say, okay, you don't have to create it here. Who are you getting help from? How are you making sure your ideation is moving at the speed of the market and your peers? And that likely doesn't mean that you're sitting in the room trying to think about the way to do this every week, every month.
I know we're short on time. I want to pick up on, just one last thought. It helps with CLE credit too, right? Stay on top of European and other legal developments. Complying with the EU AI law is going to be significant. It's going to change your cost-benefit calculation. Having compliance programs that stay on top of AI drift, it's different from anything you've ever seen before. So that's something the board really needs to do and make sure that they're asking management whether they're really staying on top of it, because the technology itself is different, but so is the regulation and the intersection of regulation technology.
Paul, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. I want to extend my thanks again to all three of you for a fabulous and exciting conversation. I learned a lot, and I hope our participants did as well. For those of you who are attendees and need the CLE code, it is SS8947. And thank you to each of you for joining.